Chapter 1: Fall of Song Civilization. In Chinese history, the powerful Song Dynasty was defeated one after another by the backward northern nations, the Liao, Western Xia, Jin, and Mongols, and ultimately fell to the Yuan Dynasty. This is a typical example of the fragility of civilization, which could be called the lament of civilization. The Song Dynasty was the pinnacle of Chinese autocratic rule, a period during which China excelled far beyond the rest of the world in politics, economy, military, culture, arts, even in science and philosophy, especially when compared to those nomadic tribes that were still in the depths of barbarism. The high level of advancement during the Song Dynasty can be illustrated by 2 points. First, the Song Dynasty's GDP accounted for 30–35% of the world's total GDP at that time. In contrast, the United States, which currently dominates the world, represents about 23.1% of the global GDP. The prosperity and splendor of the Song Dynasty can be seen in the famous painting along the river during the Qingming festival. Second, according to records, the Song army already had firearms, including cannons and fire lances, just like modern muskets. Although their range and power were certainly far inferior to modern weapons, if the Song army had further researched and developed them, they would have been more than enough to deal with cold weapons like bows and curved swords. However, despite such advanced civilization and developed weapons, the Song Dynasty fell, while the Mongols easily conquered cities and nations in Central Asia and Eastern Europe using the same firearms they had seized from the Song army. So, how could such an advanced and developed regime experience defeat after defeat, ultimately leading to its collapse? Some argue it was due to the Song Dynasty's civil officials managing the military, leading to greater chaos and weakness. Others say it was the corruption and appeasement policies of the ruling elite. Regardless of the reasons, as we lament the fall of the Song at the Battle of Yashan, we should be reminded of the fragility of civilization. And the more advanced the civilization, the more fragile it is. In contrast to fragile civilizations are barbaric regimes that disregard human dignity and even life. The following 2 historical events illustrate this point. During the Battle of Chosin Reservoir during Korean War, the Chinese Communist forces were willing to sacrifice the lives of countless soldiers in extremely cold weather to engage the U.S. military. Many of these soldiers were less than 20 years old, were young recruits taken by the Kuomintang, and after surrendering to the Communist Army, were hastily sent to the battlefield in Korea. The Chinese forces aimed to encircle and annihilate the U.S. 1st Marine Division, which had only about 13,000 soldiers, with a Chinese force of 160,000. In the end, the U.S. military broke through after suffering over 700 casualties, while the Chinese forces suffered nearly 90,000 casualties, most of which were due to freezing, starvation, or wounds. This is a clear example of the communist leadership's disregard for soldiers' lives, a barbaric act. Despite extreme weather, the U.S. military repeatedly offered ceasefires and even retreated for humanitarian reasons. However, the Chinese forces were relentless, preferring to let their soldiers freeze to death, forcing them to lie in the snow and ambush, or charging without food for days. When their hands were too frozen to fire their weapons, they were ordered to throw grenades and explosive packs instead. After defeating or driving the U.S. forces, their first act was to search for food, then to strip U.S. soldiers of their clothing to keep warm, and only after that did they consider taking useful or valuable items, and lastly, they collected weapons to present as trophies to their superiors. They were nothing more than a barbaric, backward, and primitive bandits. Nearly 1,000 years ago, the Crusades were essentially an act of invasion dressed in the guise of a holy war. Most of the fanatical Catholics involved were from the lower classes. The majority had no military training, and many, after selling their belongings, joined the campaign without decent weapons or armor. They took a long journey of thousands of kilometers on foot without food supply, forced to beg or steal all the way. When they reached the front lines to engage in battle with the Muslims, they suffered devastating casualties, like cannon fodder. The Crusades and the Battle of Chosin Reservoir have many similarities. Both were incited and manipulated by religious leaders, the Pope and leader of CCP, respectively. Both campaigns were hastily organized, with no regard for the aftermath or the soldiers' well-being. Both were characterized by barbaric behavior to the point that the supporting nations became weary of the soldiers' incompetence. Both paid a tremendous price in lives, yet their efforts were glorified, even if celebrated. In short, both were foolish and unjust wars. The difference lies in the fact that an army of the lambs was composed of Western soldiers misled by the Catholic Church, while the other was made up of Chinese achieve soldiers deceived by communist ideology. Another difference is that the Crusades accelerated the Westerners' adoption of Eastern civilization, while the Korean War led China to further merge into the reactionary Soviet sphere, distancing itself from the Western civilized world. When I see President Biden happily walking off an airplane, optimistically declaring that he has reached a so-called Taiwan agreement with the CCP, I can't help but think back to the eve of World War II when British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain stepped off a plane holding up a piece of paper, claiming he had secured peace for Britain and Europe for decades to come. The resemblance to history is striking, even to the point of repeating itself. Back then, Britain and France secretly signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler, sacrificing the Sudetenland, a part of Czechoslovakia, to Germany. Could it be that the elderly Biden, with failing eyesight, plans to betray the 23 million people of Taiwan and sell them out to the Communist Party of China, just as Chamberlain sold out Czechoslovakia? Let's take a closer look at some more examples of fragile civilizations. Most people would oppose and abhor the practice of organ harvesting, yet the CCP offers wealthy individuals around the world the opportunity to perform organ transplants through medical tourism. So-called civilized nations' wealthy elites, driven by self-interest, health and longevity, readily accept this barbaric practice. This shameful trade is always continuing in secret. As some analysts have pointed out, sometimes the CCP's regressive actions receive inexplicable support from certain politicians in organizations like the United Nations. If investigations were conducted into this, it's likely that the source of the problem could be traced. Those politicians may have either accepted bribes from the CCP, money or women, being controlled by the CCP, with compromising benefits or security threats, or, more likely, they have received organ transplants themselves. This highlights how difficult it is to resist the CCP's threats and temptations of an civilized society. If the civilized world fails to promote the ideals of democracy and rule of law to authoritarian, backward nations, then the spread of authoritarian tyranny and the ideology of privilege will inevitably infiltrate and undermine the entire world. Here's another example. In early September 2021, a newly approved refugee in New Zealand committed a violent act in a supermarket, indiscriminately attacking people with a knife. This incident not only harmed the goodwill of the people of New Zealand but also further demonstrated the fragility of civilization. It proved that simply focusing on human rights and freedom, without accompanying strict measures, leaves a rule-of-law society powerless in dealing with thugs and hooligans. In the aftermath, the once peaceful and tranquil New Zealand quickly amended the Terrorism Suppression Act and tightened immigration screening and restrictions. This violent event not only hurt the people of New Zealand but also had significant implications, creating obstacles for those who truly hope to immigrate to a free and democratic nation eagerly. In July 2022, the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, one of the most influential politicians in Japan, was publicly shot to death in the street in a Japanese city called Nara. This event once again revealed how fragile modern societies have become, a truth that should send chills down our spine. It is also worth considering the paradox in democratic nations. In a democracy, it's harmless to raise a placard insulting the president, while the person who held a sign and insulted the CCP's leader was actually beaten. Also, in democratic Taiwan, raising a flag of CCP's perfectly fine. Betraying the flag of Taiwan in a CCP-controlled state is deemed as anti-China foreign forces, and leads to suppression. Civilization often appears too rational and too kind in the face of barbarism, allowing to run rampant lie in civilized societies, while in a barbaric world, civilization has difficulty struggling to take even a step forward. Recently, I came across some so-called overseas democracy activists who questioned why civilized nations should behave like the barbaric CCP in seeking revenge on their relative indigents. I scoff at this idea. These individuals no waver removed from their suffering, flaunting their happy lives in the free world. Have they forgotten the pain they once endured, or are they simply tearing down the bridges that helped them escape? Do they genuinely want to encourage and lead the people within China to recklessly challenge the full-armed CCP, like kicking against pricks, or are they just part of a group of elite individuals in China who left the country due to factional conflicts? Without fighting back or holding the CCP accountable in democratic countries, the overseas democracy movement is bound to decline. Because if you don't hold the CCP accountable, it will surely infiltrate, undermine, and even destroy you. And while you operate openly in the free world, the CCP operates in the shadows within its own territory, working clandestinely overseas with great success. Let's not forget, the CCP has already used various methods to successfully assassinate several dissident leaders abroad. This, too, is a manifestation of the fragility of civilization. In conclusion, the ability to protect democracy and civilization globally is under constant threat from authoritarian regimes, as evidenced by these tragic examples. The resilience of democratic and civilized societies must be consistently reinforced, as the forces of barbarism and oppression are always lurking, seeking opportunities to exploit the vulnerabilities of human rights and justice.